Hello, welcome to Property Point. I'm joined as always by Nerida Conisbee, Chief Economist of REA Group. Hi Nerida.
Hi, how are you?
Very good. Nerida, I want to talk about what's happening in the property market. You know, the big story really is that the market is softer. What are you seeing?
Yeah, look, there's no doubt that the market is softer. When we have a look on our site and we look at growth from last year to this year, it's certainly come off a lot. It's very different when you have a look across capital cities, though. On one hand, we've got Sydney, and that's the weakest market at the moment on our site in Australia. And then on the other hand, we've got Hobart, which continues to see really, really high demand.
So, from an investor perspective, they're already seeing that the market is softening up. You know, do you see that continuing through?
Certainly in Sydney, I mean, when we have a look at pretty much every measure, when we look at buyer demand is off, rental demand is off, offshore demand has reduced. When we have a look at apartment demand, you know, pretty much everything has come off a lot since last year. So very different to Melbourne, where things have slowed, but they're certainly not declining in the same way that we're seeing Sydney declining. It's not all of Sydney, but when you have a look at the places that are seeing the least demand on a suburb basis, it does tend to be areas where we've seen very high levels of development, and now the demand really isn't there. So Sydney Olympic Park is probably ground zero at the moment in the Sydney market.
So, what is really driving this weaker demand? Because, you know, on certain elements of the economy, you know, we're pushing ahead, interest rates are still very low. What's really driving all of this?
Yeah, for Sydney, I think it's just pricing got too expensive. And, you know, particularly when we have a look at, I mean, a good example is offshore buyers, and Chinese buyers are still in the market. They're still looking in Australia. Interestingly, they're still increasing in the Melbourne market. So the numbers looking at Melbourne are still increasing. If we go to Sydney, we're seeing drops. And I think it's just because it's become too expensive. If you have a look at investors typically want to spend under 750 grand on a property, you know, whether that's an apartment or a house. If you try to buy something of that price in Sydney, there's not much available. Even new stock, you know, there's very little new stock at that price point. If you go across to Melbourne, there's still lots available. Even Brisbane, you know, Brisbane was a market that a lot of people were worried was in a situation of oversupply, but those issues seem to have really been resolved at the moment. So I think Sydney, it's just pricing. We just hit a peak, and you know, when we have a look on a suburb basis, we can see quite clearly that when suburbs hit a very high price point, we see buyers back off. I think for Sydney, it's now just happening on a city level.
Yeah. Have we got to a point now where prices have actually dipped below the gains made, say, over 2017?
No, not really. No, I mean,
Yeah.
look, it depends where you are. I mean, in Sydney, you know, I mentioned before Sydney Olympic Park, and those prices have come off a lot, but they were coming off already last year. If you go to the inner east of Sydney, the lower North Shore, the northern beaches, the inner west, we're seeing very different situations. So there's not as many buyers out there. They've certainly pulled back, but there's certainly not the big price declines that we're seeing in other parts of Sydney.
Yeah. So we're not at a point yet where really we can say, you know, prices have dropped below where they were. They're still above pretty much where they were anyway, even if they have come off a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the declines have only really started happening in Sydney since around January. So it's only been like 4 months of declines. I think they stabilised a bit in April, so in March. So, you know, that they are coming off, but they're certainly not dropping rapidly at this stage.
Now, recently you put out some data showing the most in-demand suburbs. I think Warrandyte in Victoria was the most in-demand. Is that right?
Yeah, so we had a look at the top 10 most in-demand suburbs. Half are in Hobart and half are in Melbourne. So, you know, when we talk about a declining market or a softening market, it certainly is across the board, but those two areas do seem to be holding up quite well. Melbourne is surprising. You know, I mean, Melbourne is a market that has continued to grow. It's seen strong price growth. But some areas are continuing to see very, very strong demand. So the outer northeast is featuring. So Warrandyte's coming up, Eltham is coming up. Inner suburbs are doing pretty well, outer east as well. So, you know, there's a real mix of housing types and property values. Hobart, again, you know, Hobart just continues to be a very, very strong performer. And, you know, the mix of the changing Tasmanian economy, low supply, you know, really catching up with that area. Launceston now is starting to see big increases in demand. So there's some spread of the property situation in Hobart going to the rest of Tasmania.
So it's like this flow-on effect really out into these, in Victoria's case, into the outer suburbs. In Tasmania's case, coming off quite a low base.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Hobart is the cheapest capital city in Australia. It's going up, but it's still the cheapest. So, it has a long way to go to become, say to Adelaide type prices. But, I think it's challenging for people in Hobart. We know that there is now a rental crisis in that city. We know that, first home buyers who live in Hobart are not really feeling as positive about the situation as, say, people coming out of Melbourne. We know that a lot of the buyers are coming out of Melbourne who are looking at Hobart prices and really seeing a lot of value there.
All right, Nerida, we'll leave it there for today.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us again. Thanks for joining us on Property Point.